Alright, so today we're going to be doing our watercolor techniques. You do need to have a pan of watercolors, whatever basic pan. This is going to be an 8-color set, I believe. So it's going to be black, brown, purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. Some sets do have additional colors. They'll be like 16 or 12 color sets. We're just sticking with the basics. And then as you move forward, you can always add additional colors or buy some for your personal possession to practice with. So in addition to having our paint palette, you're going to need to have preferably watercolor paper. Today we're going to be just doing in our sketchbook. The reason why you would never want to do an actual artwork for watercolor or paint in your sketchbook is because the paper's really thin. So this is a thin paper. It's usually like 50 pound, 40 pound, sometimes lighter, and it's just thin sketch paper. Watercolor paper is normally like 120 pound, and it's thicker, and it can be really absorbent. So that's when we do our final ones. We always do it on actual watercolor paper, but you can practice on regular paper, or if you want to buy a watercolor sketchbook at the store, buy that to practice in. In addition to your paper source, your paint source, you'll also need to have a brush, preferably something synthetic because that will work really well with the watercolor, and then a cup with water in it. And this is just a can that I recycled. Then you can recycle one for yourself, and you can use that for your water can as well as storage. So I save these for my paintbrushes also. First things I want you to do is we're going to make some boxes. So you can write watercolor at the top of your paper, put a line underneath it, and then we're going to split it going long ways, going down. So my paper is vertical right now, which means it is up and down, or portrait mode. Alright, and then you can divide this in half, and half again on the big one, and one more time at the bottom. So you should have 8 boxes total, 4 on each side. So 8 boxes total. My little Sharpie is gone. This top one, go ahead and write dry brush on there. Dry brush. Then wet on dry. And we'll have wet on wet. Then do flat wash. Oh, wet on wet. Sorry. There you go. And flat wash. Then we'll have a graded wash, so that's like a gradient. And we'll have a very graded wash, so that's going to be like an ombre but with different colors. And we'll have glazing and a bleeding or bloom. The bottom is glazing, Glazing, and bleeding or a bloom. So write those down. And when you have them all written down, put that pencil down so I can see. Which is this one? So I'm going to go through it from the top. So again, this is watercolor techniques. We're going to do dry brush, wet on dry, wet on wet, flat wash, a graded wash, very graded wash, glazing, and a bleeding or bloom. Go ahead and get your brush, your paintbrush that's in the cup. So when you want to get your cup out, instead of tapping it, so some people will tap it really hard. If you have pigment on the brush and you tap it, what would happen? What would happen? It'll spray everywhere. So when you like clean off your brush or dip in the water, just kind of drag it along the edge. Okay? So a little bit of water, but I don't want it dripping, so I'm just going to kind of wet it off. And I'm going to dry this, or I'm going to wet my pigment just a little bit. I want it just barely wet because we're going to do the dry brush technique. So we just want to activate the pigment. So you want to pick a color. I'm going to do blue. And I just want to activate a little bit of it because I'm not going to need a lot. Then, because we're doing dry brush, I'm going to dry off my brush on a paper towel. So dry off on a paper towel, dip back into that wet pigment that I just did, and I'm going to dry brush on that technique. So I'm just taking my brush and I'm painting, and I'm mostly using this side. So I'm barely pressing down, and I'm just kind of dragging my brush along. So this is nice because it can get you those cool techniques. You get those drag marks, and then you can get lighter to darker areas. So again, you activate the pigment first by adding the water to it, then kind of dry off the brush so it's not as wet. Come back and you can paint. And you get that drier look. So this adds really cool texture, so it kind of gives a more rougher look for texture versus the next one, which we're doing is wet on dry. When ready to switch to the next technique, you'll want to clean off your brush. So all I'm doing is I'm going to tap it gently on the bottom of the cup, kind of drag it up the sides to make sure it's out of the sides, and then wipe off on a paper towel just to make sure it's all the way clean. Then I'm going to dip back into the water. When I dip into my water, I like to dip near the top. That way I know that's the cleanest. Watercolor water lasts for a very long time. I use my watercolor water even when it's super, super dirty, unless it's darkening up like one of my brighter colors. So if my water's really dark and it's making my yellow or white, if I have white look darker, then I would switch it. So dip in the water, pick another color. I'm going to do green this time. And I'm going to get it nice and soupy, so nice and wet. So you see I have the water in there. It's nice and activated. And we got some paint going on. And we're going to do wet on dry. So wet on dry is when you have the wet paint, a wet brush, and you go directly on a dry piece of paper. So notice how the difference between the dry brush and how the wet brush looks. And y'all can even try like drawing things with this as you go, or just kind of shaping your brush. The more pressure you apply, the thicker the line's going to be. The lighter you press, the thinner. When y'all are painting, you want to be very, very gentle with it and just barely press down. This brush is very light and it can't stand a lot of pressure. You could even try adding a different color. So I'm going to clean off my brush. Maybe let's go for orange, which is kind of its opposite. So green and red are complement colors. Orange is similar to red, so it's going to make the colors contrast really well. You can come back and add other colors. What's really cool with watercolor is if you just go nice and carefully, you can kind of just get into little cracks. Or you let it dry and you can just kind of get right up in the area. the more pigment that's on the brush and the less water, the darker it is. If I want to thin it out, I'll get lots of water and next to no pigment, and that'll thin out my paint. So where it's kind of making it like a tint or a value. So this is wet on dry. So next will be wet on wet as we finish up this one. And I'm going to get through the techniques. You'll be able to go back through and kind of finish them up, practice some more, do another paper with some more also, or do a practice image. So the next one, we're going to need to clean off our brush. So clean, and then again, make sure to just kind of drag on the edge. I just tapped mine, and that was a no-no that I was supposed to do. You're going to wet your brush. This is going to be wet on wet. So we actually want to wet the paper first. We're going to activate the paper first. So brush wet. Apply the brush quickly, spread out the water. Do not let the water pile up. I just want a nice thin layer real quick on top of my paper. So I don't have a ton of water, just a little bit. Then activate the color that you want. And start painting wet on wet. Notice how things change. What happens to it? Look at the difference between wet on dry versus dry brush. What happens when you go back and add more water to it? Notice how the water, the paint will travel more because the surface is already wet. So it'll travel kind of across it more. And if you put the water already on there and just kind of tap it in there. So wet on wet. Then you can clean off your brush afterwards and do your flat wash. So a flat wash is one color going across the entire thing that you're trying to keep consistent. This is normally done with a thicker brush because the little brush is more for details. So when doing flat wash, like on your actual project, you'll do a wider brush. So you can activate the color that you want. So I'm going to do red. And I'm going to mix lots of water so I have enough pigment on there and enough paint mixture to complete this. You're okay. Once I have it nice and soupy, I'm going to take it and I'm going to go all the way across and keep it going. I want it to look consistent as possible. So that means I want the darkness or the pigmentation, the value, the transparency to be about the same. So the reason why this is easier with a bigger brush is because the bigger brush covers a bigger area. After the flat wash, you can do the graded wash next. So that's, again, doing one color. But you want to fade it, so you want to give it value. So it should start dark and fade to light. So pick a color that you want to do it with. So I'm going to do green. And I'm going to start kind of darker up near the top. So I'm applying lots of pigment. As I go down, I'm going to dip into my water and start adding just water. So that way it fades out. So again, started with pigment, now I'm just dipping into water and fading what's already there down. And so that way it becomes this nice value gradient. So just water going all the way down so that it spreads out that green, and you have a nice dark to light or light to dark happening. So you always start with it darker where you want to start, and then as you go further away, you just add water. And then for the very graded wash, again, that's going to be various colors that are gradients. You can use multiple different colors. So I'm going to do 3 different colors. And they can be similar colors, they can be different ones. It is easier to transition colors that are similar, but you can do colors that are different. So I'm going to start with blue. I'm going to come up here, I'm going to do blue. And then get a little bit of water, fade that out. Then I'm going to go to purple. So right in between these colors, you see how they're not mixing as much? I want water in between the colors, and I'm going to take that water back and forth until those colors kind of blend together more. After the purple, then I'll do some red. Be a little different. And again, where these 2 colors touch, come back with more water and make sure to blend really well in between. And then keep going to whatever color you want to do next. So I could do like orange next. And then some yellow. Or whatever color I want to end it with. And so that way you have a gradient wash. And that is a very gradient washed. So when applying these, you start with the color, little bit of water, do your next color. Then before you do the next one, you have to go back between the 2 colors and kind of use your brush to blend between with a little bit of water. Next will be glazing. What we'll want to do for glazing is we're going to do stripes of color, so we're layering them on top of each other. So glazing is a thin layer, and then you come back with another thin layer going across it. So I want you to start with 3 different colors for the bottom, so whichever 3. Let's do warm colors on the bottom. So warm colors are orange, red, and yellow. And I'm just going to make some stripes of colors. And I'm cleaning off in between. And we're going to let those tack up and dry up really quick before we come back with the color going across it to make it layered. So do your 3 colors initially. And I'm just doing stripes of colors, leaving some blank spots in between. I can make some areas thicker. Let me see. Bless you. And then we're going to let this dry, and we're going to go ahead and bounce over to bleeding or bloom. So for the bleeding or bloom, what I want you to do is I want you to get a color really nice and activated, so really wet. I'm going to go with yellow for this one. So lots of water with my pigment, so it's nice and soupy like. And I'm going to take it and I'm going to apply it on here, come in, dip into my cup with lots of water on it, spread all this out really well. So I want this really wet. So pigment and lots of water. So I'm dipping into my can and adding extra water on top to get the paper really wet. So wet the pigment, paint it, add lots of water right on top, get it super, super wet. Then this is where the magic happens, and you gotta do it quick. Pick another color that you have that's already activated, dip into it, and then let it drop. So the reason why you have to do this quick is because in order for this to work, the paint, the water underneath or the paint underneath has to be wet. If it is not, it will not work. And you can experiment with dropping different colors inside it, or wetting a smaller area and letting it drop in. So this is bleeding or blooms, but notice how, like, if you go and put it on a dry area, you can't, it won't activate. So this is already painted, and then going back to try and paint on top, it doesn't work. It has to be wet underneath for it to bloom or be activated. So that's bleeding or bloom. And then once you do that, you can jump back over to the glazing. It's almost dry all the way. And you can come back with your other colors on top. So I'm going to come back with a purple. And again, glazing is just lots of water, a little bit of paint, and it's a thin layer. So I'm going to come across, bring more water back. So notice how you can see some of the color underneath it shining through. So this is a great way to layer colors together. But again, you do need lots of water so that it's just a thin layer. So if you initially paint it and it's too thick of a layer, just come back with water. Don't add more paint. So you have your paint, a little bit of paint, glaze it, and if it's too thick, get more water, go over it one more time. And so that way it is layered on there. So those are 8 basic beginner watercolor techniques. Again, you did have your dry brush, your wet on dry, wet on wet, flat wash, graded wash, the very graded wash, which is several different colors, glazing, and bleeding or bloom. There are lots of different techniques, and if we have time, I'll be going over more of them. There are also countless videos on YouTube available. Also, if you want to practice at home with your own set at home on your own time. That being said, for the remainder of class, what you're going to be doing is you'll flip open to a new page, and you can actually practice applying the watercolor technique to an image or a drawing. Before you do that, because we're not going to sit here and wait for this to dry, one other thing you can do is when you have wet watercolor, if you come back with a paper towel and press on top, it'll remove some of it, but you'll also get a really cool kind of thin layered look. So it kind of removes some of it. Okay, so once you finish the techniques, flip open a new page, and I want you to apply at least 3 of these techniques to a practice drawing. So at least 3 techniques to a practice drawing.